Iran did not move toward a ceasefire because American pressure finally worked. That is the first sentence you need to hold on to. It moved because China touched the one lever Tehran could not survive without 6 days before the ceasefire was publicly presented to the world. An Iranian delegation quietly boarded a China Eastern flight out of Tehran. No public schedule. No official announcement, no cameras. By the time that flight left the runway, the most important negotiations in this war were no longer being shaped in Washington or Islamabad. They were already being shaped in Beijing. That is where the story begins. Not with Pakistani mediation theater, not with Donald Trump claiming victory, not with the public announcement on the 8th of April. It begins with a quiet flight to the capital of the one country that had both the leverage and the discipline to force Iran toward a settlement without needing to fire a shot. Because the real story is not that a ceasefire appeared. The real story is that China pressured Iran into accepting one, and in doing so exposed how little control Trump actually had over the political end of his own war. Everything turns on that distinction. The United States controlled the kinetic dimension. China controlled the solvency dimension. And in a war like this, the actor that can decide whether your state still gets paid can matter more than the actor launching the missiles. That is the logic beneath the headline for years. China has been the overwhelming buyer of Iranian crude, not a useful customer. The customer that mattered above all the others. Industry estimates have consistently put China's share at roughly 85 to 90% of Iran's sanctioned oil exports. These barrels move through dark fleet routes, relabeling schemes, ship transfers, and all the shadow mechanisms that let the trade exist without existing on paper. But whatever the paperwork says at the end, the practical truth has been simple. China has been the central external buyer keeping Iran's most important revenue stream alive before the war. That flow was running at roughly 1.6 million barrels a day. That number is not abstract. It pays salaries, it funds ministries, it supports subsidies, it underwrites the Iranian state's ability to function while sanctions grind away at everything else. And then on the 12th of March, 2 weeks into the war, that flow stopped, not with a grand announcement, not with a sanctions speech, not with a dramatic public threat. It just stopped. Chinese refiners and buyers that had spent years taking Iranian crude under layers of plausible deniability were quietly told to pause new contracts and refuse cargoes that could not show secured passage. Beijing did not need to explain itself. It simply closed the tap and waited for Tehran to understand. And Tehran understood very quickly. Within days, Iranian exports to China have fallen from roughly 1.6 million barrels per Doran Y to under 300,000. That is not normal wartime disruption. That is economic decapitation pressure. It landed at the exact moment Iran was already paying for war, already absorbing sanctions, and already carrying inflation so high that the ordinary machinery of state was dangerously exposed. That is the pressure that actually mattered. America was using bombs. America was issuing threats. America was talking in the language of surrender. But the lever that genuinely shook Tehran was a quiet Chinese decision to stop buying. That matters because Iran had spent decades preparing for American kinetic pressure. The system was built to absorb sabotage, assassinations, airstrikes, cyber attacks, and military shocks. It had designed itself around surviving visible violence. What it had not designed itself around was the sudden loss of its one indispensable economic backstop by the state it had increasingly treated as its strategic insurance policy against the West. That was the rupture, not just financial, psychological, because Beijing was not supposed to behave like a conditional partner at the exact moment Iran needed unconditional economic oxygen. And once China had Tehran's attention, it did not just apply pressure, it translated pressure into a framework. That is the second critical point. According to the reporting that surfaced after, Wang Yi communicated a set of conditions to Abbas Araki in late March. China was willing to resume oil purchases, reopen credit channels, and support reconstruction commitments. But Iran had to move toward a ceasefire on terms China could live with. Those terms mattered. Iran had to accept a ceasefire that did not require prior American withdrawal from the Gulf. Iran had to reopen Hormuz for commercial traffic on a timetable. Iran had to stop attacks on Gulf oil infrastructure. And Iran had to allow a Chinese-backed channel to run in parallel with and ultimately above the Pakistani mediation track. That is real leverage, not just telling someone to stop, giving them the economic means to stop while making clear that those means will not exist if they refuse. Iran accepted the broad framework on the 27th of March. That means the public ceasefire announced on the 8th of April was not the true beginning of the settlement. It was the public packaging of a structure that had already been privately shaped. The architecture was Chinese. Pakistan provided the public stage. The United States tried to speak as if military pressure had produced the outcome. That mismatch is why the later talks collapsed so badly. When Washington arrived, expecting to refine or harden the settlement, it discovered too late that the most important parts had already been pre-shaped by a logic that was not American. No unconditional surrender, no total humiliation package, no clean symbolic victory. Instead, the framework was built around survivability, phased reopening, negotiated nuclear sequencing, and clauses pointing toward reduced American military presence as part of confidence building. That is not Trump-S war ending on Trump-S terms. That is China writing a post-war geometry that Iran could survive and Washington could not publicly admit it no longer controlled. This is where the story stops being about ceasefire credit and becomes a story about strategic leverage. Trump mistook dominance. In the violent phase for control over the settlement phase, China did not make that mistake. China understood that in a war tied this tightly to oil, choke points, inflation, and shipping exposure, the actor that can finance the exit can outrank the actor dominating the battlefield. That is why the American blockade ordered after the collapse of the Islamabad talks looked less like a clear strategy and more like political reflex. It was a response to losing control over the terms, not a plan to regain it. And 5 days into that blockade, the contradiction was already visible. Iranian exports did not die, they shifted. Tankers began routing toward Gwadar, the Pakistani port under Chinese operational control. Cargo could be reworked there and sent east through channels that made direct U.S. interdiction politically explosive. What America could theoretically stop, it could not practically stop without risking a crisis with both Pakistan and China. That is why the blockade looked strong and felt weak. It was loud enough to declare, it was not effective enough to sever the economic architecture China had already begun rebuilding. Export volumes started climbing again from wartime lows, still reduced, yes, but rising. And that rise carried a message. Beijing's pause had not been abandonment, it had been pressure. China shut the tap to discipline Iran into a framework, then reopened the broader relationship once that framework existed. That is how strategic leverage works when it is real. Then came the public layer. Wang Yi invoked freedom of navigation using language Washington itself has relied on elsewhere. The People's Bank of China upgraded Yuan, based settlement channels with Iran. Xi and Putin discussed a multilateral Gulf security architecture built around regional states rather than external powers. These were not disconnected diplomatic noises. They were components of a coordinated response to an American escalation that Beijing read correctly, not as proof of restored control, but as a symptom of lost control. And that is the hardest thing for Washington in this story. Not that America lacks force. It has force in abundance. Not that it failed to punish, it punished plenty, but punishment was not the same as leverage. China could offer Iran something Washington could not, a path out that did not require the Islamic Republic to surrender its identity, collapse its regime logic, or submit to theatrical defeat from Tehran. As perspective, that matters more than rhetoric because regimes do not choose dignity in the abstract. They choose survival under conditions they can narrate at home. That is exactly what Beijing gave them. So the real question now is not who gets credit for the ceasefire. The real question is who has leverage over the next phase of the war. Right now, the answer is not the White House. It is Beijing. From here, three futures are visible. Trump can escalate further, trying to smash the Chinese authored framework before it becomes permanent. That means more direct coercion, more dramatic moves, more insistence that Washington still sets the boundary conditions. But that road risks forcing China to move from quiet financial leverage toward more overt support. The second future is quieter, and more likely the Chinese framework absorbs the public collapse of the Islamabad process. The blockade remains more theatrical than decisive. Iranian exports recover through alternative routes. New talks appear elsewhere. The final structure ends up looking very close to the one Beijing already shaped, even if others are allowed to stand in front of cameras. The third future is the one Washington would hate to describe. Honestly, managed retreat. The blockade is eased. The U.S. footprint declines over time. The Chinese-backed framework becomes the operating post-war logic. American military prestige survives, but American political primacy in the Gulf is reduced. I do not know which path wins, but I know what this war has already revealed. The real story was never just about ships, missiles, airstrikes, or the public drama of coercion. America ran the kinetic war. China shaped the political exit, and the exit matters more because the exit decides what kind of region exists after the shooting becomes less intense. That is what losing control of your own war looks like. Now, not battlefield collapse, not humiliating retreat under fire, but the quiet discovery that the outcome you thought you were dictating is being structured elsewhere by the rival power you have spent years telling your own voters is the central strategic threat. Trump said there would be no deal except unconditional surrender. There is now a deal taking shape. It is not unconditional. And a surrender, if that word belongs anywhere in the story, is not Tehran surrendering to Washington. It is Washington discovering that the region it thought it could still command is already learning how to settle around it. The tankers are moving through Gwadar, the Yuan channels are open, the Pakistani public stage is fading, the Chinese private track is still alive. And somewhere in Beijing, Iranian officials are not debating whether there will be a post-war order. They are reviewing the terms of one that is already being built. That is not the end of the war story. That is the beginning of the order story. And in the order story, China is no longer watching from the side. China is writing.